Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Raggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. This is Generation Jihad, the podcast that covers all things in what used to be known as the global war on terror, but we now call the Long War. Today is Friday, and my co-host, Benham, is unfortunately traveling. Well, fortunately for him, but unfortunately for me. But also, fortunately for me, we have a guest today, and that guest is David Daoud, my friend and colleague at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. David is a senior fellow at FDD, and he focuses on Lebanon and Hezbollah, and he's just a go-to on this issue and anything related to Iran. David, thanks for joining us. Great to have you on.
Thanks, Bill. It's a pleasure to be on with you again.
No, it's a pleasure. We got a lot to talk about today. A lot going on with Hezbollah, a lot going on in northern Israel, southern Lebanon. Let's just jump right into it. David, so there's been, we keep waiting for this war, this full-blown war to kick off between Israel and Hezbollah. What is the status of the fighting right now in northern Israel, southern Lebanon? And are we seeing an increase attacks? Is this still the same old drumbeat that we've experienced since the beginning?
Look, I mean, one thing I've been emphasizing since October 8th, particularly since January 5th, just to quote Nasrallah, sometimes we need to take him at face value, is this is a war, right? He said this. We are full part of this battle. This is a war. Now, as you know, wars can take on different forms. They can be high intensity, low intensity. But where you have a situation where you have constant daily, multiple times a day attacks from one side and retaliations from the other side, right? What else would you describe that as? It can't classify it as mere frontier incidents or border clashes. So this is a war. Where it intensifies, it remains to be seen. Now, it has kind of adopted a certain tempo, and I think we can get into the reasons why Hezbollah remains kind of within that tempo, and the Israelis also have not gone beyond that. But what we have seen is that at different points where one side or the other may cross a red line, you'll see punctuations, let's call them, minor escalation. Now, within those relatively minor escalations compared to the standard tempo, within those escalations, you can risk creating a bigger escalation, unintended or otherwise. You unintentionally kill a civilian, grandmother, and her son, right? There's a price that has to be paid for that. You assassinate a Hamas official who's just kind of hanging out in a shawarma cafe in Beirut, right? There's a price that has to be paid for that. If the price that's to be paid for that includes a high-ranking IDF general, again, the response is going to be higher than it would be if you're just hitting open land or something. So there is always the room for unintended escalation. Where this is going to go, I think, remains to be seen. I think we can discuss the moving parts that are keeping it in place. And that'll give us kind of an indication of where this could go moving forward.
Earlier this week, on Wednesday, the IDF said it struck a series of quote, terror targets in Lebanon, including a military asset used by the Hezbollah terrorist organization and operated by Iranian forces, end quote. Do we have any more details? Joe Truzman and I, we discussed this Wednesday, but that was coming out just as we were doing the podcast. Do we have any more details on what was hit here?
We absolutely do. So the IDF said that they had struck an airstrip used by Hezbollah to launch, obviously not planes, but more likely attack drones or loitering munitions. This is actually something that wasn't just recently discovered. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant had talked about this at Reichman University on September 11th of 2023. He gave a detailed briefing at the time about the pictures with numbers about the nature of this airstrip and who was running it. So this is what was struck. It's in an area called Birkat Jabur, which is near Jazin in South Lebanon. It's not exactly on the border. It's a little bit more of, if you're familiar with the security zone that existed in South Lebanon prior to 2000. So there were two withdrawals. There was the first withdrawal from Jazin, I think, in 1999, and then the final withdrawal. The Jazin enclave kind of went really deep into, the I guess the eastern sector of the security zone. That's where this is located, kind of the tip of that. So we know it's an airstrip that's used by Hezbollah. This is something that's been known to the Israelis, and within the past couple of days, so I think it was actually the same day, the Hezbollah had announced that they had targeted an Iron Dome battery in Bakhblum with loitering munitions, and they're making a big deal out of this. And again, the Israelis haven't revealed any damage. Hezbollah is obviously going to exaggerate the impact of this, but presumably these loitering munitions were launched from this airstrip, and this is why the Israelis targeted it to kind of at least not put it permanently out of commission, at least dent its operations.
Were there any indications that any Hezbollah or IRGC, obviously Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps officers, were killed in this attack?
No, it doesn't seem like there have been many. I mean, Hezbollah will put out the numbers of their casualties daily. So far, I've been checking in the past couple of days. They haven't updated anything. Clarify, I didn't check it this morning yet, but the past couple of days, it's been static. In terms of IRGC, no, not in this attack. That doesn't mean they weren't present. Again, this relates to wanting to keep both sides, right? Wanting to keep this low intensity war within certain confines. You can target an asset and not kill people, right? If you can get away with that, and I think the preference here is to just damage and not provoke even further. We could talk about the wisdom of that policy, but yeah.
Yeah, I think you know where I fall on that. You really want that to stop. Oh, and by the way, the IRGC, they also have been very clear when their commanders or operatives have been killed. So they've released statements as well. Just how pervasive is the IRGC presence inside Lebanon, particularly in the south? Do we have an idea of how many advisors and IRGC commanders are actually operating inside Lebanon?
Look, it's hard to tell, and I don't think it's a static number. I think it's going to fluctuate given circumstances. I would imagine in a situation, and look, it's not like exactly we can ask Hezbollah and get an honest answer. There has been a narrative that may be kind of this retroactive, anachronistic narrative to build up the cult of Soleimani's personality. But there is this narrative that's been built up that during the 2006 war, he was there throughout. Right. And again, is this fact, or is this the cult of personality of Soleimani that they've tried to build up since he was killed? I would imagine, though, that, there are low-level commanders, low-level advisors there on the ground. The number is going to fluctuate. But look, at the end of the day, Hezbollah is the IRGC. That's something we need to remember. So if we really want to talk about the actual numbers of the IRGC, I think every Hezbollah fighter, commander, official is they may be Lebanese, they have Lebanese citizenship, but they serve Iran's interests. They are ultimately loyal to Iran, even if they take Lebanon's domestic constraints into consideration. And those are effectively IRGC officers.
That's an excellent point that I also make with respect to some of these Iraqi and Syrian militias as well. Maybe a little less so for the Houthis, but I might be coming around to that anymore. But yeah, some of these, I remember the designation of Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, and he was the head of the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq. He was a founder of Hezbollah brigades inside of Iraq. And his designation I want to say it was 2007, but it may have been 2009, described him as an advisor to Qasem Soleimani. I mean, if he's an advisor to Soleimani, I always argued this with people, what did that make him? Did that not make him a member of the IRGC? And what about his lieutenants? And I think that's a really excellent point that you make, David, that at this point in time, groups like Hezbollah or Hezbollah brigades or Asiba Haq or Harakat Hezbollah Nigaba, these are all Iraqi militias I'm mentioning here, they're carrying out the will of Iran and Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And, at what point do we have to consider them to be part of the organization? Sure. And I think Iran is crafty enough to take those local considerations, the issues that Hezbollah has to deal with in Lebanon, that Hezbollah brigades or Asiba Haq have to deal with in Iraq. And that's all part of the
All part of
machine.
the
And
strategy. Yeah,
yeah,
that's part.
yeah,
That's part of the strategy. I mean, you don't want to undermine your proxy in the geography or the geographical territory where they exist, right? If your goal is growth, and this is where we kind of get confused, I think. The goal of the Islamic Republic isn't necessarily to destroy Israel, right? It isn't necessary. That is a goal, but it's not the top priority, right?
it's
It
not
is
the
to count.
immediate goal.
It's
Yeah.
not, yeah, it's not the ultimate goal, right? It's that is a goal along the path. Again, destroying
Yeah,
American influence in the
Iran wouldn't
region.
stop what it's doing
No, it
if
wouldn't.
Israel
Yeah,
collapsed
exactly,
today.
exactly.
Right.
So the goal we have to understand is growth. It is to export this revolution. It is to build statelets slowly but surely through the exportation of this revolution that mirror and operate like the Islamic Republic. So if your goal is growth, you don't undermine the growth, right? You don't score a tactical win and accrue a strategic failure or a strategic loss. So if you're looking at Hezbollah, you have to take Lebanon into consideration, not because you care about Lebanon, not because you care about Lebanon's interests, but because you care about Hezbollah's interests in growth in Lebanon, because that's an extension of your growth. Um, and I mean, that's the I don't know the genius of the model. I'm gonna get like flack for calling them geniuses, but no, they're a smart adversary. They know how to operate. And if you don't want the roof to collapse in on your proxy's head, you have to care for the roof.
No, it's absolutely correct, David. And as I say all the time, and I know you know this, we shouldn't apologize for giving credit where credit is due. I mean, I they have a smart strategy and they have the will to execute it, and we have to respect that. And we lost in Afghanistan because we didn't respect the Taliban. We thought they were a bunch of a third-rate militia that was tired and was moderate and all these other things, these ideas that we impressed upon them, but wasn't really true. And unless you respect your enemy, you there's no way you could address it and meaningfully try to defeat it. So, yeah, and it's a lot like the communist strategy, right, of the Soviet Union, right? They spread their revolution. They spread their communist doctrine through multiple countries. I don't think the communists were actually though as clever as Iran. I think Iran is far more willing to work through its proxies and understand their difficulties. Where I don't want to get into a whole discussion on this. Where I think the Russians or the Soviets were far more willing to sacrifice pieces on the chessboard. Um, which ultimately makes them far more dangerous. And there's genius to their strategy, and we have to recognize that.
And they also have something that I think the Soviets didn't necessarily have was an organic base. And that's where the strategy starts. You have a Shia base that is disenfranchised for whatever reason. You start there, and that's where you start pulling them into the ideology. And once you have a base, right? A terror group without a base is a criminal organization. It's finite, right? Once you have a base, you have renewable numbers, right? Then you're a legitimate part of the local conversation, right? This is how Hezbollah can say we are a critical social and political component of Lebanon. This is how they can have influence in Lebanon that is not, achieved through fiat or coup or force. They have force just in case, right, as a backup measure, but they sit at the table and they argue like everyone else. And when you come with, what was it, 250,000 votes in the last parliamentary elections, uh, can't be ignored.
And not no, that's the genius of what Hezbollah isn't. We just can't. I think we have to stop thinking about these groups like Hezbollah as just a terrorist organization. It's far beyond that. They have political components that can wield significant influence. We're seeing the same with the Iraqi militias. Obviously, Syria, a little different because I would say there isn't politics in Syria. It's literally just a war zone with warlords in different areas. Um, the Houthis, look at what the Houthis have as far as again, we just can't look at them. I mean, there's meaning the Houthis were relisted as a terrorist organization. I get it. Fine. There's value in that to a certain degree, but they're far more than that. They possess a military. They run a country, and
They have social arms, they have quasi-governmental arms, shadow governmental arms. And I think it's more appropriate to look at them the way we look at Iran, which is state, that isn't a terrorist organization necessarily, but does either commit or sponsor acts of terror in furtherance of its overall strategy, which is growth. That's one of the tools in the toolkit, right? It's like saying we're a sanctions organization as the United States, right? Because we overuse sanctions, but no, that's a tool in the toolkit, right? And terrorism is one of the tools they use in the toolkit. And if we don't look at them holistically, I don't think we're going to understand either what they are, how they're growing, or how to fight them. Um, so I think starting, coming to that conclusion that maybe Hezbollah isn't a state yet, but it's a state in the making. If actually, ironically, it reminds me of the Yishuv, right? The proto state that the Zionists had built in Israel, using the British mandate as scaffolding. And then, you have all the institutions of statehood. Once the British mandate ends, you have a ready-made state. And this looks to me like what Hezbollah is doing in Lebanon, what the PMF, not as advanced yet, but it'll probably get there in Iraq. Syria, we're still at the proto stage. But again, Hezbollah wasn't this in 1982, right? This was a slow accumulation. But states in the making, that's how we should view them.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another great point. Yeah, you're right. They're not quite there, not full control of the state, but they're, how do we classify them? Like Iran, it's easy, right? We classify Iran as a state sponsor of terrorism, right? Same thing with North Korea. It makes sense, right? Hezbollah's in this gray zone in between a foreign terrorist organization and a state sponsor of terrorism. Same thing with the Iraqi militias. I mean, maybe the Houthis might be the closest thing that you can, but they don't fully control the state of Yemen. But they might fit. I'm way out of my league here. We're talking legal issues, and David, you are a lawyer, so you certainly can put me in my place. But certainly interesting conversation. Certainly something that as we have these discussions, it gets my brain going, gets that hamster in the wheel in my head going. But I feel like we're trying to, stick the square peg in a round hole by looking at Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. And then you see confusion, right? Where some countries say, well, we're not going to designate Hezbollah's, political arm, just their military arm. And you come up with this real strange dissembling on what Hezbollah is and how we should treat it. There has to be something in between, but far greater minds than mine will probably figure that one out one day, or probably not. I have a feeling we'll just keep going down this path.
And if we don't figure it out, it's going to be to our disadvantage. I mean, case in point, the political versus military wing distinction. I don't know how that can be sustained when Hezbollah itself mocks it as a fiction.
Right.
And, this is in furtherance of a policy, primarily, if we're going to pick on the French, right?
Why not?
This is a French-led policy that the goal of which is to kind of maintain Lebanon's stability. But Lebanon's stability and Hezbollah don't really, and Hezbollah's growth don't really go hand in hand. You will have to destabilize Lebanon to get rid of Hezbollah, but that'll be kind of the surgery phase, right? But to sit there and deal with Hezbollah as a legitimate actor, as you would any other actor in Lebanon, as problematic as those actors may be, Hezbollah is in a unique category, and say, well, this is in the interest of making sure Lebanon doesn't collapse. Except what you're sponsoring, again, is this entity from within that is hollowing out the country slowly to build, using it as scaffolding and no more to build its own statelet. So it's a self-defeating policy without,
That's exactly what I was going to say. I mean, as you're trying to keep Lebanon stable, it slides further and further into the hands of Hezbollah,
because you're legitimizing if not the source of instability, but the barrier to reversing Lebanon's instability, and that's Hezbollah. Hezbollah getting rid of or weakening Hezbollah is step one to starting to fix the entire system in Lebanon that makes Lebanon such on the cusp of being a failed state. But I don't know. This is I don't know if we've veered off a little bit, but yeah, this like conceiving of our adversaries properly. I think we look at them through a particularly Western lens that makes sense to us as Westerners when they're operating in a very different mindset. They're operating along very different terms. Yes, Iran sits in the United Nations. Iran participates in all the international organs like every other state, but its mindset about what it is fundamentally different than, say, what Germany's is and what its role in the international system is. Germany views, I'm picking a random Western country, Germany views these institutions as um, pillars of global stability, right? It wants to strengthen the pillars for the sake of the pillars, whereas a country like Iran wants to use the pillars to strengthen itself, and in the process undermine the pillars, which constrain its abilities and the abilities of its partners, be it Russia or China, to operate as they want to. So we're not looking at things the same way. We're, like you said, we're dealing kind of like what we were dealing with the Taliban in Afghanistan. We impute to these actors intentions and motivations that would be ours but aren't theirs.
It's a recipe for disaster, and it's why we fail in these wars. There's multiple reasons, right? And a lot of it is will. I think we have a problem here in the United States where we have, foreign policy isn't viewed as it was viewed decades ago, where it was consistent, essentially is consistent across administrations. Now we have 4-year and 8-year swings in foreign policy. And exactly what you had just described there, this idea that we can define the enemies the way we want to define them, as opposed to what they actually are, or how the enemies view themselves. And that really is a recipe for failure in the long term. No, and by the way, we are, we're talking Hezbollah here, so we're not jumping all
Yeah,
over the
no,
place
we're
here.
not. We're not. I mean, when Hezbollah puts out a statement, it's important to distinguish between the bluster, right? Because they are an organization that likes to exaggerate its accomplishments. But when they tell you their intentions, right? Bluster and intentions, we need to distinguish. We need to believe their intentions and stop this, you know, hyper nuanced. And I've used that in a very negative way. I think nuance is a great thing, but once you there's a limit, right? Once you go so far that someone tells you, "Hey, I want X," and you're like, "Well, no, you don't really want X. You want 1, 2, 3." That does a disservice to us because they genuinely do want X, right? In this case, when Hezbollah puts out a statement, I think we need to believe their intentions, even when their list of accomplishments or other things may be an exaggeration. But take them at face value when they tell you this is what we want. This is how we want the world to look.
David, I know you're looking at Hezbollah 100% the right way. This is how I was able to succeed in understanding the Taliban and its intent. So they publish Voice of Jihad in 5 different languages. And I would check occasionally to make sure, especially statements, the intentions, right? And look, the Taliban would exaggerate. People would dismiss Voice of Jihad because, the Taliban claimed they killed 40 people in an attack, and it really only 10 were killed and 30 were wounded. And I'm like, well, the Taliban often don't distinguish between, but whatever, right? So I would always concede they exaggerate the effects of their operations, the outcome of the operations, but they never lied about that operation occurring. And then you had to look at their intent, and that was the key. I would cross-check, very important statements, and they weren't just communicating that to us. It was being communicated in Farsi, Daru, Pashto, and Arabic, and Urdu as well. Actually, 6 languages. So they weren't just communicating to us or trying to make they were communicating to all other people, and you have to take that very, very seriously. As soon as you start dismissing the intent that they are communicating, particularly when they're communicating it to, because look, I don't think they're stupid either. They understand that information isn't as it was in 1980. You issued a statement and it went out one way, and that's all the people saw. Everyone has access to this information. They don't want to be seen as lying, particularly on their intent to their own people. So yeah, it's the right read, and I really think I'm curious. What do you think the reasons for people doing this in Washington, particularly? I know it happens in Europe as well, but we're creatures of DC to some degree. I try not to be as much as possible, but what do you think the reasoning is that people
Sure.
fall for this?
I look. I think part of it is in maybe it's an inherent psychological tendency to impute your perspective onto the other, right? And we do this in interpersonal relationships. I'd say that's part of it. I think the other part of it is there is a need in the DC policy sphere to always appear at a certain level of sophistication, whether, again, that sophistication is justified by facts or not is irrelevant. It seems like we get into this game of philosophizing for the sake of philosophizing. And the kind of the yardstick of your intelligence or your enlightenment becomes like, well, how deeply can you take something rather than sometimes, the Occam's razor approach, or, just take something at face value when necessary. So you get into this realm where you're you know, no longer dealing with the facts, you're dealing with, I don't know what. I think also part of it is paucity of knowledge. And this is an overcompensation, or this is a compensation, that a lot of these people, and if I may, besmirch my environment here and talk ill of
You
my
may.
colleagues, um, look, most of the people that are working on this stuff don't, if they know the language, they've learned it in a few courses somewhere at a university. And even if you're fluent, just fluency in language is not enough, because you have to understand the cultural mindset behind language. You have to understand the role that ideology, religion, all of these things that we in the West no longer have as strong operating factors play in the role of Hezbollah's, a group like Hezbollah's ideology. When they tell you that they believe in the Mahdi's coming and that this is going to bring about a certain type of world that they aspire to, they mean that. They mean that like I mean that love my parents, or that you love your children. That to them is absolutely real. And I think where we get confused is we don't believe such things in the West anymore. That doesn't operate as policy, right? Messianism, at least that kind of messianism, we can talk about our own messianism in Western society, but that kind of messianism, that kind of eschatological thinking does not set policy goals in the West. And where I think it gets more confusing is that actors like Hezbollah, and Iran, unlike actors like ISIS, proceed along the path to achieving that goal in very rational, very smart, very pragmatic ways. Right? They're achieving irrational ends through absolutely rational means, and I think that throws confusion in. Um, and so I think all these things together, you get this mix of confusion that passes as analysis. I remember, Augustus Richard Norton, to speak ill of the dead, or at least to criticize the dead, was one of the proponents of the argument that Hezbollah had Lebanonized in the 1990s, right? That, in its early days in the 1980s, this was truly, a pro-Wilayat al-Faqih Iranian revolutionary entity. And sometime in the 1990s, a switch flipped in their head and they decided to become Lebanese nationalists. And all they wanted was to liberate South Lebanon from Israeli occupation. So, the way you approach such an organization is obviously different than you would from a revolutionary organization that is using the South Lebanon occupation as an excuse to grow its military strength, to grow its arsenal. So once that excuse is done, they're like, well, now we're too powerful for you to defeat, or for you to disarm, for the Lebanese. And that's exactly what happened. And that happened, that insistence on the Lebanonization of Hezbollah happened in spite of all the facts, happened because Hezbollah knew how to focus its attacks in a certain way. They knew how to play the war of minds very smartly, but they never at any point said that our war against Israel or the West ends at the blue line or ends at a delineated border. And we see this, by the way, again now. The most amazing thing is that now that you can't have that pretense anymore, because in the 1990s you could say, well, Hezbollah hadn't overtly, invaded Syria on behalf of Iran. They hadn't trained Iraqi militias. They hadn't gone to Yemen. They hadn't done all these things that have nothing to do with liberating Lebanese territory. Now they have, but yet you have a policy that 1701, the implementation of 1701, and potential border negotiations, delineations of the kind of the remaining, was it, I think 6 out of 12 points that remain disputed in the land border between Israel and Lebanon. The assumption behind this is that if this is delineated, and if there is a permanent border between Lebanon and Israel, then Hezbollah's raison d'etre will go away. This underlined Ehud Barak's withdrawal from South Lebanon, and as he still sticks to the fact that the South Lebanon withdrawal was a good idea. He can make that argument for himself. Um, but
Yeah, tell that to the people in
yeah,
northern Israel.
exactly. Well, tell that to Hezbollah. Tell that to Hezbollah, which the whole premise was, okay, we withdraw behind the border. Hezbollah loses the excuse to attack and fight Israel. That clearly didn't happen. Within months of the withdrawal, you had kidnappings of soldiers and continued attacks. That was 23 years ago, 24 years ago. Now we're talking 24 years on, and that same premise still underpins the policy with which we're now trying to diffuse the situation on the northern border or the southern border, depending what perspective you're looking at. But that's the same. We still don't want to take Hezbollah at face value when they tell everyone, their base, publicly, yes, we want to liberate every inch of Lebanese land, or what they perceive to be Lebanese land. But then the fight against Israel doesn't end. We are winning by increments. We will pray in Jerusalem one day. That's the goal. That remains the goal. That's been the goal since day one. They've never lied about that.
Yeah, I think there's an aspect. I agree with everything you said. And look, I'm going to add one thing. I don't speak Pashto, Dari, Urdu. I had I was fortunate enough to have the Taliban issue their statements in English. So I don't think it's necessary, although I will say it would have been quite helpful for me to help understand. But everything else, I completely agree. I think if you given enough resources, or if the enemy is helpful enough, you certainly can. You certainly can do it without the weapons. I think it's most important. Go ahead, David. Sorry.
Yeah, but I think where you're going around that is that you're trying to understand the mindset.
That's exactly what I was going to say. The mindset is most important.
Exactly. And when you lack both the linguistic tool and the desire or ability to understand the cultural mindset, then you're blind. Then you're analyzing it through how you would analyze, the considerations or the motivations of political parties in the United States, right? Or actors in the United States, right? You're not, and that's a different metric. You can't compare Joe Biden's or Donald Trump's motivations to Hassan Nasrallah's. It's not even a difference in degree, it's a difference in kind. And you can't begin to understand that until you have a desire to sit there and understand these people on their own terms.
Yeah, you have to be able to red team it, these people, these groups. And what would I do if I were them and I thought this way? This is how I would act. It's really that simple. You have to understand their ideology a little bit. You have to understand the region. You have to understand, the history. But, I don't think you need to be experts on any of that if you understand first and foremost their mindset and their motivations.
Getting past this intellectual gap that's like when they tell you their motivations, like no one could think that. No one could possibly want that. Right. But what if they do? Like, what if they do? Consider the possibility.
Exactly.
Because they're telling you, and it's not just they're telling you, right? They're moving in increments towards this, right? Just because they're not operating in one fell swoop, just because they're not suicidal necessarily, does not mean that they are not incrementally moving towards. So you have the statements, and you have like kind of an arc of history, if you will, to back it up. But still, we insist on like, they can't possibly mean that. Who could possibly mean that? How many times have I heard from people that, regarding Hamas, for example, they can't possibly want their children to die. Really? Well, what if they do? What if they do? What if they are that sick and that the value of the cause outweighs the value attached to a child, your own child?
And what if they're actually producing children's shows that promote suicide bombers and martyrdom? That's the thing. You have to take what they do and match it with what they say.
Yeah.
And then at some point, but then people will look at that and they will still deny it. And I think another part of the problem that we're getting back to, right? Why did people think in Washington or beyond think this way? Because I'm convinced in Washington that outcomes and policy preferences are what people want. They don't want the facts. And you said that. You stated that. And they're not looking at the facts. They say, I want the U.S. I keep going back to Afghanistan because that's my bread and butter, right? We want to leave Afghanistan. Well, how do we leave Afghanistan? We can't be, Al-Qaeda can't have a significant presence. They can't have ties to the Taliban. The Taliban must be moderate. The Taliban will respect women's rights and girls going to school and stuff like that. And we manufacture these.
We manufacture our own version of the Taliban. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Because the goal is to leave Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So when you go down that path, you're going to fail.
actually a great point. I think that's an excellent point. Not to cut, but like that's an excellent point because I think the implications of an accurate image of these groups, right? They're attendant policies that you have to take, right? Perhaps war, perhaps you're up to leading up to war that could. So if you want to avoid that, do you then just delude yourself into avoiding that?
There's self deception.
Yeah,
Look, I understood. Again, on Afghanistan, that there was no will for the U.S. to stay there. My argument was, okay, that's fine if you want to leave. I don't agree with it. I think it's a mistake, but let's not pretend what we're leaving behind is something that isn't. Um, and but that's the thing. In Washington, they can't admit that. They can't. That's an admission of failure. It's an admission of weakness or cowardice. But I'll be honest with you, we'd have been far better off leaving on those terms than what we pretended to leave behind and what we all witnessed in that summer. And unfortunately, we make these. I see the same mistakes. Hamas attacks Israel, a horrific attack, which would have equated to about 20,000 Americans dying. I always just say to people when they're don't understand what happened. I said, could you imagine if the drug cartels, Mexican cartels, crossed the border, killed 20,000 Americans, raped them, burned them, kidnapped, say 2,000 of them? What would your reaction be? What would our reaction be? And yet we're sitting here trying to lecture Israel for a two-state solution. I mean, this is absolute insanity.
right, yeah, right now, yeah, and at this moment, and I think. Look, this goes back to the delusional thinking, the unwillingness to kind of understand the implications of reality, because the implications of reality are much more troubling than these fictions that we create for ourselves. I mean, whether a two-state solution is desirable in the ultimate, in the ultimate scale or the ultimate scheme of things, how do you do it now, right? How do you
do
do
we
it
even
now?
talk about this
Yeah,
before Hamas's
yeah,
defeat?
yeah. Yeah, and look, we also, I think, where the United States, maybe this impacts kind of the DC policy thinking set, but um, we are a country blessed by geography and by neighbors. Look, for all of the problems with the southern border and drug cartels, Mexico and Canada, we're bordered by two of the most peaceful countries in history. We have the Pacific Ocean and we have the Atlantic Ocean separating us from any potential adversary. The margin of error that we have as the United States, therefore, to make errors like we did in Afghanistan, to make errors like we have, in countries abroad, we can withdraw, and Afghanistan can fall apart, and we will never even hear about it unless CNN or Fox News or whomever decides to report on it. We can ignore the problem. It is a very different situation when you're dealing with countries like Israel, where, in case of Gaza, your backyard's fence is the international border. And that's not an exaggeration. That's literally the case in some places where your backyard's fence, that is the international border, or where on the northern border, you can see the whites of the eyes of the person who's trying to kill you. Where when you withdraw, you are not withdrawing across, the Atlantic Ocean. You're withdrawing 20 kilometers, maybe less, and you're still seeing your adversary.
Which Israel literally did in
Which
2000.
which Israel literally did in 2000, and the adversary again, Hezbollah didn't move mountains; they moved a few feet. Right when you look at the security zone that the Israelis had in South Lebanon, this isn't it's not even the size of the West Bank. This is a tiny little strip of land. Um, that's all it was. That was the thin line between Hezbollah being right on the border and being a few feet away, or a few kilometers away from the border, and that gives a country so much less margin of error where again the Taliban can take over Kabul and no one has to evacuate, I don't know, the suburbs of New York, right? Whereas 80,000 people, up to 120,000 people, I've been reading from northern Israel, maybe more if Hezbollah continues to target deeper into Israel, have evacuated. Right, the entire north is shut down economically, in terms of life. The strain on the government's budget, the morale strain of having, again, the most powerful military in the region unable to secure the peaceful and quiet enjoyment of life of 120,000 of its citizens out of a country of 9 million. We're not talking, again, even on the scale of the United States. And that's a very different calculus. when you look at the problems of these countries, again, this is again the perspective issue we were talking about. Not only do we look at our adversaries from our perspective, we put our allies, if we're still treating them like allies, uh, as if they're in our shoes, as if they have all the luxuries of, again, the blessings of American geography, our size of population, our global impact, the size of our military, the size of our economy. We are a unique historical phenomenon, the United States, and we can't compare even England to us, right? Definitely not the Israelis.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, and people do forget, and it's what's made us complacent. It's what made us have the luxury of having some crazy ideas when it comes to what to do and with respect
Yeah.
to foreign policy. I couldn't agree more. You segue very nicely, unknowingly to you, to my next question. So the reports that Hezbollah or that Israel wants Hezbollah removed from the area of the southern Lebanon that was south of Litani. That's part of the agreement per the agreement of the UNSC, the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701. The IDF, they even mentioned this in sort of obliquely about how Hezbollah is operating south of the Litani. In that strike we talked about earlier that you had said was on the airfield. Do you think this is is this actually feasible for the Israelis? Are the Israelis, if they want Hezbollah removed, they're going to have to go in and do it by force? What would compel Hezbollah to leave?
Are we saying is it feasible militarily or is it feasible diplomatically? I can answer both.
Yes, exactly. The whole range. I realize I threw three questions there at once, but yeah, what are the possibilities here?
Let's break it down. So look, UN Security Council Resolution 1701 was passed in the wake of the Second Lebanon War. The immediate background for this, right, was Hezbollah's launching of an attack into Israel, kidnapping 2 soldiers, killing others, launching, massive attack into Israel, Katyusha rockets, mortars. This led to the Second Lebanon War. This was the threat that 1701 was meant to, to deal with, right? So you have two levels of requirements as relates to Hezbollah and Lebanon. And I would argue that the bulk of 1701's requirements, obligations, fall on Lebanon. So you have a de minimis requirement, which is to distance Hezbollah, and it's not named explicitly, but again, this is where the background comes into play, because the Lebanese like to play this kind of this legal sleight of hand where it's like Hezbollah is not an armed group, it's resistance, but really, again, once you look at the background, it's very clear that Hezbollah's action was the motivation for 1701. So giving that context, the de minimis requirement is to distance Hezbollah north of the Litani. This is Lebanon's obligation in conjunction with UNIFIL. The maximum obligation is to disarm Hezbollah and all armed groups and to stop the importation of weapons into Lebanon that are not authorized by the Lebanese government, right? So basically, implicitly saying, hey, Iran and Syria, stop sending weapons to Hezbollah. Now, Lebanon has an obligation to police its eastern border, where probably most of this is coming, Beirut International Airport. It's been, I fought in the Second Lebanon War. I was a kid when that happened. It's almost been like half of my lifetime, and it's been almost 18 years. Not a single one of those requirements has been met. Right? In terms of even Lebanon's deployment of forces to South Lebanon, Lebanon had committed to deploying 15,000 forces, committed itself unilaterally, committed to deploying 15,000 Lebanese soldiers to work to cooperate with UNIFIL in South Lebanon. That hasn't been met, according to their foreign minister, Abdullah Abu Habib, just on LBCI a couple of days ago. Right? So 18 years on, even the most minimal action from Lebanon has not been accomplished. There's been pressure from the Israelis. Obviously, their daily overflights, their daily incursions, periodic activities in Lebanon. Strictly speaking, these are violations of 1701, violations of 1701 Lebanon's sovereignty. You can justify them as countermeasures, given that Lebanon has not lived up to any of its obligations, and the situation remains, right? There is a strong case to make there. So we have that 18 years, right? Around the same time, a year before, the United States, after the assassination of Hariri, Syrian withdrawal, we start training the LAF. Part of the State Department saying this, right? Part of the thought process behind training the LAF is that we created as a counterweight to Hezbollah. Again, going on 19 years, we've seen no results. Um, let's take it even more closely, right? Don't want to go back into no, it's now ancient history. Um, since October 8th, we've had these attacks on unilaterally started. This is by Hezbollah's admissions. They started unilaterally attacking northern Israel. Suddenly, the international community reawoke to the fact that this is a problem. We've had what 111 days now, if I'm not mistaken, of negotiations. There were attacks this morning, right, from South Lebanon to Israel. Whatever movement, right? The Economist had a report that Hezbollah had moved maybe a couple of miles, or sorry, a couple of kilometers north of the border. Even they admitted that was tactical. Hezbollah has denied, any movement of its forces permanently. Now, even if you could accomplish a tactical withdrawal, right? Let's say for now, the international community somehow manages to get Hezbollah to move north of Litani, and Israel's like, okay, we're not going to go to war. How do you guarantee that that's going to stop, or that's going to remain the case permanently? Given that the actors that are meant to guarantee it, UNIFIL and LAF, have failed to do so over the course of 18 years, right? This isn't 2 months. Um, and this goes back to Lebanon's, what we would call in legal parlance, unwillingness or inability to fulfill its obligations under 1701. And this isn't, again, David Daoud stating this. This is Lebanese Foreign Minister Abdullah Habib just last week in LBCI saying, us doing this would be civil war. And if our choices are civil war versus regional war, we will pick regional war every time, because you can stop a regional war. Civil war has no end. So in the Lebanese calculus, the price of disarming or constraining Hezbollah will always outweigh the price of leaving Hezbollah to do its business. So that long-winded answer is basically to say, like, the diplomatic approach, even if it works, can only work temporarily because there are no guarantees, right? Unless some other force wants to go in and occupy South Lebanon and do it with authorization to use force against Hezbollah movements into South Lebanon. I also don't see how that's feasible, but even again, in a theoretical, unless you have that, even if Hezbollah for some reason agrees to go north of Litani for now, you cannot guarantee that they will not return. All their infrastructures in the south, right? They're not going to abandon everything they built since 1982, but definitely since 2006. Permanently, when, as we talked about earlier, their objective is ultimately to pray in Jerusalem. Again, one salami slice at a time, that is their objective. Not just them, but the collective resistance axis. So that leaves you with one option, really. And it's not a savory option. It's the option of, like, okay, if Lebanon is unwilling or unable, and when you decide to act in self-defense under Article 51, there are requirements of an armed attack having occurred. I think 111 days.
Yeah, I think there's enough justification there.
There's definitely. I mean, we can go into that, but, like, definitely there's enough justifications. But then you have necessity and proportionality, right? Necessity is like, have you exhausted all peaceful means possible, reasonable peaceful means possible? Recourse to Lebanon, UNIFIL, the international community. We just went through those. The Israelis are being more patient than they have to be right now. So what does that leave as the necessary? Is war then necessary? Is some kind of military action beyond the countermeasures that they're doing, right? The Israelis are striking in Lebanon. They're hitting artillery strikes. This isn't stopping the problem. It's not pushing Hezbollah north. It's not pushing Hezbollah out. It's not stopping the attack. So that also goes into the necessity. And then that kind of segues into proportionality. What's proportional, right? If the actions that you're taking, these counter battery fires, right? These countermeasures short of war are not stopping Hezbollah. Do you have justification? It increases the justification, I would argue, to create at least some kind of buffer zone to unilaterally move in, since Lebanon doesn't want to do it. The international community can't do it. UNIFIL can't do it. The countermeasures can't do it. Maybe the only thing that can do it is recreating the South Lebanon security zone in a much more buttressed manner than it existed, from 1985 to 2000. Do the Israelis have the capability? I think they do. I think there's been a narrative that's been circulating around. And look, I'm personally no fan of Prime Minister Netanyahu, but that does not mean that everything he touches is evil. And I think it's important to say that, because the narrative that is now growing, you see this kind of anonymous U.S. officials saying this to Washington Post, right? That Bibi is trying to prolong the war, perhaps open a second front to prolong his political career. Not everything the man is doing. Again, there's a lot of criticism to be had, but not everything he's doing is going to be for that. So I think there's this artificial narrative that's being created that Israel isn't doing it for the right reasons or won't be doing it for the right reasons, and it doesn't have the capability to do it. And I think that in terms of manpower, is not a small army, right? The Gaza part of the war, and I just can't call it the Gaza war because it's part of this broader war that's already going. It's wound down considerably. There have been brigades demobilized, right? That frees up more resources and more troops to operate along the northern border. The issue then becomes resupply by the United States of critical weapons, be it Iron Dome or what have you. That's a separate question that I can't answer. I'm not in the mind of policymakers, but in terms of Israel's inherent capability, I think it does have the capability to, if where in the past, Israel failed against Hezbollah, it was not a lack of military prowess. It was a lack of understanding because Israel is a democracy, because you do have civilian control of the military, because you do have the leaders of the military, meaning the prime minister, the defense minister, the cabinet, ultimately responsive, to the electorate because they want to maintain their support base. Where the failure happened was that the Israeli public in 1985 to 2000, for example, did not understand that eliminating Hezbollah was worth the price that would have had to be paid to eliminate Hezbollah. They're like, these ragtag militia, who cares? Right? We're going to lose, we're going to lose 100, 200, 500 people to get rid of them. That's not worth it. Who are they anyway? 2006, it was almost the flip side. The political echelon did not have the will to do what was necessary vis-a-vis Hezbollah, to go in all the way. Right, the Second Lebanon War essentially amounted to a bunch of border skirmishes in terms of ground troops, with airstrikes deeper into Lebanon, and some commando operations in in Baalbek. But ultimately, that's not enough to win. Right now, you have an alignment, I think, for the first time when it comes to Hezbollah, between public sentiment, public understanding of the magnitude and gravity of the threat. Right, that this is going to be October 7th, hanging over your head like Damocles' sword from the north, if Hezbollah is allowed to remain on the border, coupled with the political will to do this. So you have this alignment that could allow the Israelis to get over the internal hiccups that prevented them from doing so from 85 to 2000 or in 2006.
Yeah. And, look, I know very little of Israeli politics. The Netanyahu issue, he's an Israeli politician, right? But this idea that whatever is being planned right now is all him. It's a unity government.
Yeah.
So whatever is happening under the agreement of people that he doesn't particularly, we won't caucus with. Yeah. So there's a love of the boogeyman, sure. The Trump, the Netanyahu, exactly. The Putins, and again, I'm not saying any of them don't have their problems, particularly Putin, but, that idea is just crazy. It's
not every decision they're going to make is going to be what we call the fruit of the poisonous tree, right? Yeah, they are going to make some correct decisions. And I think when it comes to Hezbollah, it's not just Bibi saying this. We're looking at the threat, right? The threat is there. And if Prime Minister Netanyahu is actually looking at the threat realistically, well, good for him. Notwithstanding everything else you can criticize about, his domestic policies, his attempts to remain in power, or what have you, but the assessment of the threat of Hezbollah is there, notwithstanding any political motivation that Prime Minister Netanyahu may or may not have, and the imputation of that to him at this moment can only mean, or it only seems to me, an attempt to dissuade Israel from doing what is necessary.
Yeah, I concur. And David, last question. Isn't it ironic that here we are 24 years later now, Israel withdraws from southern Lebanon, Israel withdraws from Gaza, and then 24 years later, well, obviously Gaza's 2005, 6, I forget.
2005, yeah.
Yeah.
18 years. Yeah.
And Israel's back in Gaza, and Israel's considering going back and reoccupying southern Lebanon. I mean, it just shows the failure of the policies within Israel by the United States, the international community, the United Nations, and also shows how Iran and how Hezbollah and how Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, how they've manipulated this situation to, it just shocks me that we're sort of back to square one. How that experiment of, hey, maybe giving them what they want will get them to stop. It's exactly what you talked about earlier.
But it's not what they want. They don't want Gaza,
Right.
right? They
Right.
don't want just Gaza. If that were the problem, then
Then it would have been over.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I don't know. I would only call it not ironic because this was obvious from the outset to anyone who was
Yes.
paying
Yes.
attention, right? That
I have no better
yeah,
word for
yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah. It's sad, but look, I mean, I think the mind-boggling part is that once this policy has been proven to have failed, the territorial, the land for peace formula, uh, vis-a-vis actors like Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, PFLP, right, that are telling you we want the whole thing, right? Nasrallah doesn't need the college students here to chant river to the sea. He chants river to the sea, and he tells you exactly what he means by river to the sea without any of this mealy-mouthed obfuscation that is meant to make what is a genocidal intent more palatable to the American public. He tells you this means the elimination of Israel. Take them at
Yeah.
face value. But at the same time, now we're like, oh, two-state solution. And one thing that should be pointed out is given the location, geography, strategic importance of the West Bank, let's say there had been a completed withdrawal from the West Bank at some point. I don't know, maybe under Ehud Olmert, because he was intending to do that at a
Sure.
certain point, the realignment, I think he was calling it. Had this attack been launched from the West Bank, just in terms of like how far uh, these terrorists were able to penetrate into Israel, they would have been able to reach Jerusalem at the very least. They would have been able to reach the outskirts of Tel Aviv, if not Tel Aviv itself. You would have had not 1,200 people, you would have had tens of thousands of Israelis killed. And that's the calculus. And that's what no one wants to sit there and say, oh, this is what the Israelis are dealing with. This is what's beyond, all those nasty checkpoints and that mean wall and those mean soldiers. Yeah, war is ugly. A military occupation is not pleasant. I don't think anyone wants to get up in the morning and do that to another people. But it's not gratuitous. And this is something that is lost here in this war over minds and hearts, where you see kind of the snippet, the nasty image of the Israeli soldier acting improperly, beating up an innocent Palestinian. That's a grievance, but it's not the issue. It's not the underlying issue. And the underlying issue is you have a side that says, we don't accept this as a border. If you give us this, they'll come for you. And once you give them that, but you're putting them within range
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
your biggest cities. So that, I think, is the irony, right? That, I think, is that after even October 7th, we're still beholden to this idea that ceding land will bring peace.
This is what's driven me crazy about particularly Secretary of State Blinken, trying to foist this upon the Israelis as they just suffered a horrific attack, as if this is an answer. And you just look at it and say, we've tried this for 24 years now, and it is proven to have been failed. And not only proven to have failed, but it's failed spectacularly and at a cost that we as a nation cannot bear. The lecturing, which I've heard is incessant behind the scenes.
Well, it's incessant. It's incessant in front of the scenes.
It's certainly in the press, but I heard it's even worse. Boy, if I was the Israelis, I just would, unfortunately, they can't afford to ask the U.S. Secretary of State to leave. I'd send my lowest ranking, deputy secretary of whatever to hey, go ahead and just listen to him, nod your head, take notes, and say thank you, sir, and walk out. Exactly. I mean, it's really offensive at this point in time. Look, I get that they're trying to find a solution, but this is not the solution that the Israelis need. It's not a solution. It's a failed solution. It's proven failed.
And sometimes I think we in the United States need to accept that sometimes solutions aren't available.
Yeah.
At least for now. At least for now. Maybe, we can't predict how situations or conditions will change in 20, 25 years. But if you keep trying to throw something at the wall and see if it sticks, you could actually do more damage than you can good. And we need to accept, and that is a difficult pill to swallow, because that has a lot of nasty implications for human beings. But I think it's one we need to swallow, that for the time being, there really isn't the solution. And this isn't, people argue, Egypt and Israel did it, except Egypt accepted that this is the international order.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Israel walked back from the Sinai. I mean, that was...
Yeah. And that's the difference. That's the fundamental difference, that you are not dealing with interlocutors or a side or a party now that is telling you, we accept this to be the end of it, right? I mean, the very concept of occupation has been redefined to argue that even after Israel withdraws from Gaza, it remains occupied. Now, what happens when you do that with the West Bank, right? What happened? Like, where do you end this game? And it is becoming increasingly a game.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, and Sadat, was killed for it, right?
Yeah.
For making peace with Israel. That just goes to show. David, thank you so much. Excellent points today. Really glad we got you on. Benham, we missed you, but you know what? David did a great job filling your shoes. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for today's episode of Generation Jihad. Just a reminder, you can find us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a review. Thanks again. We'll see you all again soon.